The property was listed as a 500-acre agricultural operation specializing in seasonal crop production. It had been owned by the same family for 3 generations according to county records. The land was zoned for agricultural use. The business had proper licensing for farming operations. Tax records showed modest but consistent revenue from crop sales to regional distributors. On paper, it was exactly what it appeared to be: a working farm in a rural area where agriculture was the primary economic activity. The call came in at 2:14 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. A motorist reported seeing what appeared to be armed individuals at a farm property approximately 3 miles off the main county highway. The caller had pulled over to check a map and noticed people with what looked like rifles walking the fence line of a large agricultural property. The caller wasn't certain they were actual firearms, but felt uncomfortable enough to report the observation. Rural areas often have legitimate reasons for armed individuals on private property: hunting, predator control, property security. The initial response was a single sheriff's deputy dispatched to make contact with the property owner and ensure nothing was amiss. The deputy arrived at the farm's main gate at 2:41 p.m. The gate was closed and locked. A sign indicated the property was private and that trespassing was prohibited. Beyond the gate, a dirt road extended approximately half a mile before disappearing over a rise. Buildings were visible in the distance, but details were unclear from the road. The deputy announced his presence using the vehicle's PA system and waited for response. After several minutes, a pickup truck approached from inside the property. 2 men exited. Both were dressed in work clothes consistent with agricultural labor. Neither appeared to be armed. The deputy identified himself and explained he was following up on a report about armed individuals on the property. He asked if everything was okay and if the property owner was available. The men explained they were security personnel hired to prevent theft and vandalism. They acknowledged they carried firearms as part of their duties, which they claimed was legal on private property. They stated the owner was not currently on site but could be reached by phone if necessary. The deputy asked if he could speak with whoever was in charge of operations. The men said they would need to check with their supervisor. One of the men made a phone call. After a brief conversation, he informed the deputy that their supervisor would meet him at the gate shortly. The deputy waited. Approximately 15 minutes later, another vehicle approached. A man identifying himself as the operations manager arrived and spoke with the deputy through the gate. The deputy repeated his inquiry about armed individuals. The manager confirmed that security personnel were employed on the property and carried firearms for legitimate protection purposes. He explained the farm had experienced theft problems in previous seasons and that armed security was a necessary measure. He offered to provide documentation of security personnel licenses if needed. The deputy asked if he could enter the property to verify that everything was in order. The manager hesitated, then explained that the property owner preferred to keep operations private and that entry would require a warrant unless there was probable cause to believe a crime was being committed. The deputy noted the manager's reluctance but acknowledged that private property rights applied. Before leaving, the deputy asked if there were any workers on the property who might need assistance. The manager stated that seasonal workers were housed on site during harvest periods and that all employment was legal and voluntary. The deputy requested to speak with some of the workers to confirm they were there willingly. The manager declined, stating that the workers were currently in the fields and that disrupting their work would impact productivity. The deputy returned to his vehicle and documented the interaction. Something about the situation felt wrong. The manager's defensiveness, the reluctance to allow even basic verification of conditions, the presence of multiple armed security personnel on what should be a standard agricultural operation. The deputy contacted his supervisor and recommended further investigation. The sheriff's office began examining county records related to the property. Building permits showed structures consistent with agricultural operations, barns, storage facilities, and what were listed as worker housing units. No permits had been requested for significant construction in over a decade, suggesting the housing structures had been in place for years. Satellite imagery was reviewed. The property showed several large buildings clustered near the center of the acreage. Fields extended in multiple directions. Fencing was visible around the perimeter and around specific structures. The housing units mentioned in permits appeared to be long, barracks-style buildings positioned away from the main farmhouse and operations center. The sheriff contacted federal agricultural labor investigators. If workers were being housed on the property, there were regulations about living conditions, wages, and treatment. Federal investigators reviewed the farm's labor records. The business reported employing 15 workers during peak season. But satellite thermal imaging conducted later that evening showed heat signatures consistent with far more than 15 people in the housing structures. The discrepancy triggered a multi-agency investigation. Federal labor investigators, immigration enforcement, and, ultimately, Federal Trafficking Task Force. If the farm was housing significantly more workers than reported, and if those workers were being restricted from leaving, the situation could constitute forced labor or trafficking. Additional surveillance was established from locations outside the property boundaries. Over 3 days, investigators observed patterns that raised concerns. Workers were visible in fields during daylight hours, but they were always accompanied by individuals who appeared to be supervising closely. No workers were observed leaving the property. The armed security personnel were present at all times, walking the perimeter and positioned at what appeared to be checkpoints. On the 4th day of surveillance, investigators observed a delivery truck entering the property. The truck appeared to be bringing food supplies. After unloading, the driver attempted to speak with several workers near one of the barns. Security personnel immediately intervened, moving between the driver and the workers. The driver was escorted back to his vehicle and directed to leave the property. Federal agents made contact with the delivery driver after he left. He stated he had been delivering to the farm for several months. He had noticed that workers always seemed nervous and that security was unusually tight for an agricultural operation. On this visit, he had tried to ask a worker a simple question about where to place some boxes. Security had immediately stepped in and told him to have no contact with workers. He found it unusual but hadn't reported it because he didn't want to lose the delivery contract. The pieces were coming together. A farm reporting 15 workers but housing far more. Armed security preventing outside contact with workers. Workers who never left the property. Management that was defensive and refused to allow law enforcement to verify conditions. The pattern was consistent with a forced labor operation disguised as a legitimate agricultural business. Federal warrants were issued for the property. The tactical challenge was significant. 500 acres. Armed security personnel of unknown number. Potentially explosive devices or booby traps given the level of security observed. And an unknown number of workers who might be held in conditions that made immediate rescue necessary. SWAT was requested along with federal tactical teams experienced in rural operations. The plan called for simultaneous entry at multiple points on the property. The main gate, a secondary access point on the eastern boundary, and, if necessary, aerial insertion to prevent armed security from establishing defensive positions. Intelligence suggested between 8 and 12 armed security personnel based on surveillance observations. The exact number of workers was unknown, but thermal imaging suggested at least 50 people in the housing structures during overnight hours. The buildings were constructed with heavy materials that limited detailed internal observation. The operation was scheduled for 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, early enough that workers would likely still be in housing before being transported to fields, early enough that security might be at reduced alertness after overnight shifts, but late enough that dawn light would provide visibility for tactical teams operating across 500 acres. 32 tactical operators from multiple agencies assembled at a staging area 4 miles from the property. Additional federal agents and local law enforcement were positioned to establish outer perimeter once entry began. Medical teams and victim advocates were prepared for potential mass casualty or mass rescue scenarios. At 5:45 a.m., teams moved into position. The approach had to be coordinated carefully. 500 acres meant that security might detect movement long before entry was achieved. Operators used terrain features and pre-dawn darkness to advance toward multiple entry points simultaneously. At 5:47 a.m., the operation began. The main gate was breached using vehicle-mounted equipment. Teams flooded through and advanced up the dirt road toward the central buildings. Simultaneously, operators cut through fence line on the eastern boundary and moved toward the housing structures from that direction. Aerial units confirmed that armed individuals were responding to the main gate breach. At least 4 security personnel were moving from various positions toward the incoming tactical teams. Radio communications between security members were intercepted, confirming they were coordinating defensive response. The first armed security member was encountered approximately 200 yards inside the main gate. He was carrying a rifle and attempted to establish a firing position behind a tractor. Tactical operators gave commands to drop the weapon. The individual initially refused, then complied when he realized he was surrounded by multiple operators with superior positioning. The second and third security members were located near one of the main barns. Both were armed and appeared to be preparing to resist. Negotiations lasted approximately 90 seconds before both surrendered their weapons and were taken into custody without shots being fired. The operations center building was secured by 6:03 a.m. Inside were 2 additional individuals who identified themselves as farm management. Neither was armed. Both were detained and separated for questioning. Computer equipment and communication systems were secured as evidence. While the main buildings were being cleared, the eastern entry team reached the housing structures. These were the barracks-style buildings visible in satellite imagery. 3 structures, each approximately 80 feet long and 20 feet wide. Construction was basic but substantial. Concrete block walls, metal roofs, small windows positioned high on the walls. Each building had a single entrance door. The doors were locked from the outside with heavy-duty padlocks, not the kind of locks typically used on housing where occupants need to exit freely. These were security locks designed to keep people contained. The first lock was cut and the door opened. Inside was a single large room with rows of bunk beds along both walls. The space was dim, lit by a few overhead bulbs. Approximately 20 people were inside. They were awake, standing near their bunks, clearly aware that something was happening outside. When tactical operators entered and identified themselves as federal agents, the response was not relief or excitement. It was fear. Several people moved backward toward the far wall. Others remained motionless. One man asked in heavily accented English if they were being arrested. An operator explained they were not under arrest and that agents were there to help them. The man translated to others in Spanish. The fear remained but intensified. Several people began speaking rapidly in Spanish, expressing concerns about deportation and consequences for their families. The second building was opened. It held 19 people in similar conditions. The third building held 19 more. Total count: 58 individuals housed in 3 barrack-style buildings that were locked from outside, preventing free exit. Medical teams entered to begin assessment. The conditions were poor but not immediately life-threatening. Inadequate ventilation, insufficient bathroom facilities, overcrowded sleeping arrangements, but people had access to water and basic sanitation. They weren't starving, though food appeared to be limited and low quality. Interviews began immediately with translator assistance. The stories were consistent. All had been recruited in their home countries with promises of agricultural work in the United States. They had been told they would have legal work authorization, fair wages, and decent housing. Transportation would be provided. Everything would be arranged. When they arrived, they were brought to the farm and told they owed money for transportation, visa processing, and housing. The amounts were substantial. They were given documents showing their debts and payment schedules. They were told they would work to pay off these debts and could leave once the amounts were settled. But the wages were far below what had been promised. Deductions for housing, food, and other expenses meant they were rarely paid anything directly. The debt calculations were manipulated so that the amounts owed never decreased significantly regardless of how long they worked. And the armed security ensured they couldn't leave to seek other employment or assistance. Most had been on the farm for periods ranging from 3 months to over 2 years. The longest-term worker had been there for 2 years and 4 months. He had been told initially that his debt would be cleared in approximately 8 months. After more than 2 years of work, he was told he still owed nearly the full original amount due to accumulated fees and charges. None of them had their identification documents. All had been collected when they arrived for processing and were never returned. Without identification and with constant threats of deportation if they contacted authorities, they had felt powerless to escape or seek help. The armed security reinforced that any attempt to leave would result in immediate consequences. While interviews were being conducted, explosive ordnance teams were sweeping the property based on the possibility that security measures might include booby traps or deterrent devices. What they found was more extensive than expected. The perimeter fence was equipped with motion sensors and cameras. But more concerning were explosive devices positioned at 3 locations around the housing area. The devices weren't sophisticated military-grade explosives. They were improvised explosive devices constructed from materials available at agricultural supply stores, fertilizer-based compounds, simple detonation mechanisms, positioned where they would create maximum psychological impact without necessarily causing massive destruction. The devices appeared designed more as deterrent and threat than as actual tactical weapons. Bomb technicians spent 3 hours rendering the devices safe. During that time, the 58 workers remained secured in a safe area away from the buildings. The presence of explosive devices escalated the severity of the situation. This wasn't just forced labor and debt bondage. The property had been fortified with armed security and explosive devices to prevent escape or outside intervention. The investigation into the property's operations revealed a systematic exploitation network. Workers were recruited through what appeared to be legitimate labor contractors in their home countries. They were provided with documentation that seemed official. They entered the United States legally in most cases, arriving on temporary agricultural worker visas. The transition from legitimate employment to forced labor happened after arrival. The debts were imposed. Documents were confiscated. Movement was restricted. And the armed security ensured compliance. The farm produced real agricultural products that were sold through legitimate distribution channels. But the labor force was trapped in conditions that violated every standard of legal employment and human rights. Financial records seized from the operations center showed the farm had been using this labor model for at least 5 years. Hundreds of workers had passed through the property during that time. Most eventually left when their labor was no longer needed or when they became too problematic to control. A few had escaped and likely didn't report their situations due to fear of deportation or retaliation. The current 58 were those who remained trapped in the system at the time of the raid. The property owner was located at his primary residence 200 miles away. He was arrested and charged with federal trafficking offenses, forced labor, harboring undocumented individuals for financial gain, and possession of explosive devices in furtherance of criminal activity. He maintained that he had trusted farm management to handle operations legally and that he was unaware of the specific conditions workers experienced. But evidence showed he had direct knowledge. Communications seized from computers detailed his involvement in decisions about security measures, worker housing, and debt structures. Financial records showed he received regular reports on labor costs that were far below market rates, indicating he was aware the operation was exploiting workers to maximize profit. His claims of ignorance were contradicted by documentation of his active participation in maintaining the exploitative system. The farm management personnel arrested on-site faced similar charges. The armed security personnel were charged with conspiracy and weapons violations. Some security members claimed they believed they were providing legitimate protection services and weren't aware workers were being held against their will. Others admitted they knew the workers weren't free to leave but claimed they were just doing the job they were hired for. The 58 workers were placed in federal protective custody and provided with comprehensive support services. Medical care for physical issues resulting from poor living conditions and inadequate health care access. Psychological counseling for trauma associated with confinement and exploitation. Legal assistance for immigration matters and potential pathways to legal status as trafficking victims. The process of helping 58 people transition from captivity to freedom was complex. Many had families in their home countries who were depending on remittances that never came. Some had debts in their home countries that they had hoped to pay off through work in the United States. All faced uncertainty about their legal status and future prospects. Federal Victim Services coordinated with nonprofit organizations to provide emergency housing, job placement with legitimate employers, and ongoing support. Some victims eventually chose to return to their home countries with assistance from international organizations. Others pursued legal status in the United States through provisions designed to protect trafficking victims who cooperate with investigations and prosecutions. The property was seized under federal asset forfeiture laws. The 500 acres that had been used to generate profits through exploitation of forced labor was confiscated. The buildings where workers had been held were eventually demolished. The land was sold and proceeds contributed to victim compensation funds. For the tactical teams, the operation represented challenges specific to rural operations. 500 acres required different approach strategies than urban environments. Armed security with rifles on open terrain created different threat dynamics than close-quarters encounters in buildings. And the presence of explosive devices added complexity that required specialized response capabilities. The operation succeeded without casualties or serious injuries. The armed security personnel were secured without shots being fired. The explosive devices were rendered safe before they could be triggered. And 58 people were liberated from a situation where they had been held for months or years in conditions that violated their fundamental rights. The investigation revealed that this farm wasn't unique. Federal task force identified similar operations at agricultural properties in multiple states. The model was effective because farms in rural areas have legitimate reasons for housing workers on site, for employing security, and for maintaining privacy about operations. These legitimate characteristics provided cover for systematic exploitation that could persist for years without detection. The break in this case came from a motorist who happened to notice armed individuals and felt uncomfortable enough to report it. That single call led to a deputy's inquiry. The deputy's observation that something felt wrong led to further investigation. The investigation revealed thermal signatures indicating more workers than reported, and that discrepancy triggered the federal response that eventually freed 58 people. If the motorist hadn't called, if the deputy hadn't followed up, if investigators hadn't pursued the discrepancies in worker numbers, the operation would have continued. The 58 people would have remained trapped, and the network of similar operations at other agricultural properties might never have been identified. The trial lasted 2 months. Evidence included testimony from all 58 victims, documentation of living conditions, financial records showing the debt manipulation schemes, communications proving the property owner's direct involvement, and expert testimony about trafficking operations in agricultural settings. The property owner was convicted on all major counts. Sentencing included decades in federal prison without possibility of parole. Farm management received substantial prison terms. Security personnel received sentences ranging from several years to over a decade depending on their level of knowledge and participation in maintaining the forced labor conditions. The investigation also examined how the operation had avoided detection for 5 years. Building permits for the barracks had been filed years earlier as worker housing, which was legal. Labor records reported the minimum number of workers required to maintain legal compliance. The farm sold its products through legitimate channels and maintained proper agricultural business licenses. Armed security on a large rural property wasn't unusual enough to trigger concern without additional context. The system was designed to blend into the normal landscape of agricultural operations in rural areas. It exploited assumptions that farms housing seasonal workers were operating legally. It relied on isolation and distance from population centers to reduce the likelihood of observation by outsiders. And it used armed security and threats to ensure workers couldn't escape or report their situations. For the 58 victims, recovery continues. Some have successfully transitioned to employment with legitimate agricultural operations that provide legal wages, safe conditions, and respect for workers' rights. Others have pursued different career paths with support from job training programs. Several have become advocates, sharing their experiences to help others recognize trafficking situations and to support stronger protections for agricultural workers. The buildings that once held 58 people in forced labor conditions are gone. The property that generated millions in profits through exploitation has been seized and repurposed. The network that operated for 5 years while hiding behind the facade of a legitimate family farm has been dismantled. And the moment when tactical operators cut locks on Barracks' doors and 58 people realized they were finally being freed remains the turning point that ended years of captivity and began the difficult process of rebuilding stolen lives.